Well, thank you very much for having us. We're delighted to be here. I'm John Parsons. I'm on the faculty in the School of Management at MIT. I've been working in energy and environment issues since the middle of the 1980s and on climate change since the middle of the 2000s. So, Emil?
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be presenting to this audience. I'm a senior research associate at MIT CEPR, and I've been working on climate policy and techno-economic modeling for climate and energy policy pretty much since Waxman-Markey, which, as many of you will remember, is quite a pivotal moment in the history of climate policy. So it's been quite a good ride. Good to be here.
And my name is Joshua Hodge. Again, thank you for having us. Pleased to be here. I'm Executive Director of the MIT Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. My background is in power, gas, and carbon market research. I've been in that field since about 2006. And I was previously with the MIT Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change.
So, Emil, you want to put the slides up?
Yes, one sec. How is that?
Great. So let's go to the next slide. So this is John, and I'm going to kick us off. I'm going to give you a little preview of what the study was about and what our results are. And then I'll get into a little bit of modeling details just to give you some perspective on how we were analyzing the problem, what we really did. And then Emil will take over and give you the results, which we can put into two buckets. First, we give you some results where we keep the existing transmission network. We don't do any expansion of the network. And we explore what's the role of hydro in deep decarbonization. And then the second set of results will be what is the impact and value of new transmission. All right, Emil. Okay, so let me give you an overall what kind of questions we're asking, what kind of modeling we're doing. So we explore what we call deep decarbonization options for Northeastern electricity grids. By deep decarbonization, we mean anything between 80 and 100% reduction from 1990 levels by 2050. It's important that we're looking at deep decarbonization. The region has already dropped emissions by roughly 50% from 1990 levels. And that began with getting rid of the coal plants and a lot of substitution with gas and some beginnings of solar and wind. We have to move forward to the next step, and we can't get rid of any more, or not very much more coal in the way of coal plants, but there's a lot we can do in expanding wind and solar, for example. But we're looking beyond that. We're looking to the last 20% of emissions reductions, and we're trying to anticipate when you get there, what are going to be the new problems, what are going to be the different solutions that you'll need at that point, primarily so that we can do a little bit of thinking now about what to do to get there. But really, we're looking at the end point. And I say the Northeastern electricity grids, our modeling is focused just on New York, New England, and Quebec. You could include other parts of the regions, but we didn't. So that's what we're exploring. What we do is called capacity expansion and dispatch modeling. So we're looking at the year 2050, and we're asking, what is the portfolio of capacity of different generation technologies you would want, and how are you going to use them? How are you going to dispatch them? You want to make sure that what capacity you have online is going to allow you to keep within an emissions constraint. So in our paper, we analyze a constraint of 80%, one of 90%, going to 99%, and then going all the way to 100%. We'll focus in this short presentation on just probably the 90% and maybe a little bit of the others, but primarily the 90%. So you have to keep to that constraint. The other important thing you have to do is you have to make sure you've got enough capacity and the right kinds of capacity so that you can always serve load in all hours. So peak load, for example. And we have to pay attention to the hourly renewable resource. When does the sun shine? When does the wind blow? And make sure that we have capacity that can provide, meet the load at all times. We focus on minimizing cost, both the capital cost of investing in these assets and the operating costs. We call it total system cost. We're going to focus on the cost of, in the aggregate, to New York, New England, and Quebec. Now, there are other issues that are relevant that we don't address. So when we talk about cost, we're not thinking about siting issues. So we don't pretend that this focus on cost is the end point and the exclusive thing to do, but it's what we have results on that should be an input into a larger discussion about what the region wants. We minimize total system cost across the 3 regions. So in a sense, we document how to make the pie bigger, how to make the cost lower and the pie bigger. We do not analyze how you divide that pie up among the different regions, what kind of institutional changes you would need so that everybody gets a fair piece of that. It's an important question, but we don't get there. So we focus, especially in this presentation, on what role Quebec Hydro can play. As I said before, we first focus using existing transmission only. So we have very important results, even if there are no new transmission lines built in the region. But then we also analyze what happens if you build new transmission from Quebec into New England or from Quebec into New York. Okay, Emile. So here on our results, you got to go back a couple slides. Our results, just to quickly summarize and anticipate what you're going to see in more detail from Emile, we show that as you approach deep decarbonization levels of emissions, the highest valued use of Quebec Hydro's assets becomes as a balancing resource, complementing expanded wind and solar PV generation in New England. So currently, Hydro-Québec sells into New England as a baseload generation, and Hydro-Québec is proposing to sell more baseload into New England. But what we are pointing out is that when you get to 80 and 90 and 100% decarbonization, the value of that resource is maximized if they switch to be using it as a balancing resource. So the other bullets point out, we show that the transmission utilization switches from one-way delivery down into New England and becomes two-way flows in both directions. Quebec Hydro is primarily used in hours when New England renewable generation is low, and Quebec in other hours when renewable generation is high, Quebec absorbs New England renewables, which reduces curtailments in New England and also allows Quebec Hydro's reservoirs to refill so that they can be sell more capacity at the higher valued hours. And the result of all of that is if you have that balancing resource, then you can expand renewables investments more to take advantage of that expansion. So all of those results are true if you don't expand any transmission. But then the last bullet point is, if you expand transmission, you can take advantage of that capacity even more. So you can expand the utilization of the hydro as a balancing resource. So this is a pretty new way of thinking about how we could integrate between New England and Quebec. And that's, I think, the value of this paper is showing this is a new way. But it is true that other regions elsewhere in the world have already realized this kind of thing. So in Europe, where Norway is primarily a hydro resource similar to Quebec, as its neighboring countries like Denmark have expanded wind capacity, it has started to become the case that they start using Norwegian hydro as a balancing resource. And that territory is thinking of expanding transmission interconnections so that Norway can be used more as a balancing resource as well. And in our countries, Manitoba and Minnesota are doing the same thing, with Manitoba providing hydro into Minnesota and Minnesota providing extra wind capacity into Manitoba, or at least that's the plan that they're pursuing. So I think it's something that here in our region, we should perhaps start thinking about as well. All right, the next slide. So a word about hydro emissions, because that's a critically important issue. In our paper, we're going to focus on one base case scenario that has no new reservoirs. So this is a result of our analysis, not an assumption. That is, we show that the cost minimizing solution for the region is to utilize the existing reservoirs, but not to build any new ones, instead build more wind and solar. So we're giving an argument in favor of a better utilization of existing assets. And then there's no new emissions from hydro reservoirs as a result of that. So that's the basic point for our basic analysis. Now, we examined a lot of different scenarios. So it's still true for most of our scenarios that there is no new reservoirs and therefore no new emissions. However, there are a couple of scenarios where new reservoirs are called for. And if that's true, then in order to make a fair accounting of things, you would have to take into account whatever the emissions might be from those reservoirs. We don't analyze that. It's very dependent on the particular reservoir and detailed information, but certainly it needs to be included in the analysis if you choose to expand the amount of reservoirs. Okay, so that's a preview of what we're going to be talking about, what the results are. Just to dig a little bit more into some of the details of our modeling, when we ask what is the capacity that we want, what's the portfolio we want in 2050, we include wind, both offshore and onshore wind as an option. We include solar PV as an option. When we look at nuclear, there are some existing nuclear units that are going to probably, well, we assume some of them will still exist in 2050 as a result of license extensions. We allow new builds of nuclear, but in most of our scenarios, they don't get built. For hydro, we have existing pumped hydro in New England and New York, existing run-of-river in all of the regions, existing reservoirs. We allow new build reservoirs, but as I said, in general, they don't get built. For natural gas, there are existing natural gas plants, which we assume will still be around in 2050. We allow the regions to build new natural gas plants, but they have to keep within aggregate emissions levels. We allow new build of natural gas plants that have carbon capture and sequestration. We allow batteries, 8-hour lithium-ion batteries, and we allow demand response. So we're just going to focus on this portfolio of options. There are, of course, other technologies that are in development that might become available to us, but our results focus on a portfolio using these. All right, and then I'm going to say one quick thing about how we model hydro in Quebec. Reservoir hydro. So we're going to treat Quebec's hydro reservoir as if it's one big reservoir, one big inflow of water, one big set of turbines taking the outflows and generating power. Now, that's not, it's a much more detailed system. There is a research literature that says this is probably not going to be a bad representation, but future people could do it in more detail than what we did. What you see down at the bottom of the slide is the monthly inflows. So in the late winter, there are very little inflows into the hydro. As spring arrives and the melt comes, there are very large inflows into the hydro system. And then the inflows taper off after the summer through the early winter gradually. So we're going to assume that's the flow into the hydro system. We're going to ask, given that you know that's the flow, what's the optimal use of the hydro system? But there are going to be constraints. We're going to assume that the reservoir can never be loaded beyond a certain level. We're going to assume that before the spring, you want the reservoirs to be relatively empty so that you can receive the spring, but not just that you can receive this spring, in case there might be a very heavy flow year, you want to have excess capacity to absorb that spring flow. We're going to assume there's a minimum output in every hour, primarily for environmental considerations, but for various other industrial and other considerations. And then we're going to assume there are limits on how fast the hydro system can go up or down. So that's a basic picture of the modeling that we're doing just at a very high level. I'm going to hand it over to Emil and ask him to tell you what our results are.
All right, thanks, John. So, hello, everyone. I will show you for the next 20 minutes or so some of the main results from the paper and start with results that show you the big picture takeaways and then drill down to more and more detailed results on what we see going on in the New England Quebec electricity system as we expand transmission. To set the stage, as a reminder, the first research question that we had was, what could a potential low carbon electricity system look like in 2050 in those regions? And what is the way that we're going to be generating and delivering electricity, assuming existing amount of transmission? First, we begin by looking at the pattern of electricity exchange between New England and Quebec as a proxy and as an indicator for how the two systems are interacting. In this chart, we have ranked all of the power exchange flows through the transmission lines between New England and Quebec from the highest to the lowest across the x-axis, across all of the hours of the year for a historical year 2018. Now, what you see on the vertical axis is the amount of transmission flow, and a positive value indicates that power is flowing from Quebec to New England, and a negative value indicates the opposite. So what we see is that currently we are using these transmission lines to exclusively send energy to New England. And this is also informing the way that we see the role of Quebec in New England's energy mix in our policies as well. The Baker administration calls it baseload hydro, for example. However, what we see when we model 2050 is that in a low carbon power system, in this case, I'm showing results for 90% decarbonization. In a low carbon power system, it'll be optimal to use a transmission line to send energy back and forth. So the optimal role for Quebec here is not as a baseload source of energy, but as a flexible balancing resource that takes energy from New England during certain hours and gives energy back during other hours. To understand this a little bit more, we can look at what the energy mix would look like in New England. Today, as you are probably well aware, we are relying on gas to a large extent, which is shown in gray, nuclear power, which is shown in orange. We have a little bit of wind and solar, some hydro in New England, including run-of-river and pumped hydro. And then on top, you see net imports from Quebec. So we're getting this baseload energy from Quebec. If we decarbonize by 90% in New England, this is the optimal energy mix that our model calculates. And there are two big key components to this low carbon mix. The first is a very expanded role for wind and solar, which are very affordable, but intermittent. So the second key component of the energy mix is resources that can balance this intermittency. You see on the bottom that there's some role for gas plants in this energy mix. And on top, you see there's also some amount of net imports from Quebec. Net imports is imports minus exports. So in this case, we find that net imports go down. This is because New England now exports energy during some time of the year, as I've already shown. If we decarbonize by 99%, the picture changes a little bit. Instead of gas plants for balancing, we're now using carbon capture and storage equipped gas plants, which you see on top in the very dark blue. And we also have, as I've indicated there on the bottom, a certain amount of lithium-ion battery capacity. And of course, also don't forget about the hydro from Quebec, which is there. In this case, net imports have turned negative because New England is exporting more energy than it's importing, which I think provides one of the main takeaways in this paper is that you know, in economics, we look at products as substitutes or complements. So in 2018, the role of that hydropower from Quebec is effectively a substitute for energy that we might generate in New England. You see it as part of the energy mix, and it's substituting for other sources we might be using. But as we decarbonize, we see that instead of Quebec being a substitute, it's actually being a complement for energy that we're generating in New England. To look across the border, I want to briefly discuss what the energy mix looks like in deep decarbonization in Quebec. In this chart, I'm showing the energy mix across different decarbonization targets in New England on the x-axis. And the first main takeaway is that for Quebec, it will be optimal to continue to use its existing reservoirs and build some amount of variable renewable energy, in this case solar, for its energy needs. And the other big takeaway is that there's no new reservoir hydro that is considered economically justifiable by our model. So the takeaway here is that Quebec and New England are meeting each other's energy needs and interacting in this mutually beneficial way by trading energy back and forth, only using the existing reservoir hydro without need for additional impoundments or additional investments in hydro capacity. Okay, so we've looked at our results on what a low carbon future could look like. And the takeaway was that in a low carbon future, Quebec hydro becomes a balancing resource. The second research question was, what would be the impact of new transmission in this kind of low carbon system? And specifically, we added 4 gigawatts of transmission between New England and Quebec to see what would happen. First, I want to discuss our results about what will happen to the optimal energy mix in this case. So in this chart, what you see on the vertical axis is the change in energy generation. And this is the change from going from the current transmission scenario to the new transmission scenario. So this is the effect of 4 gigawatts of additional transmission. And on the horizontal axis, I've shown different energy sources and how they change. So on the left, the first takeaway here is that new transmission results in more generation from variable renewable energy in New England, wind and solar, especially solar. And that energy is substituting for gas. Toward the right side of the slide, you see existing CCGT and new CCGT. So these are, this is an acronym for gas plants with combined cycle gas turbines. And what the picture is saying is that if we installed more transmission, this would mean that it would be optimal to use less gas and to use more renewables instead. Why is that? Well, as I've already shown, Quebec in this low carbon future acts as a balancing resource for New England. And so if it's a balancing resource, it obviates the need for having other balancing plants in New England. So it reduces our need for gas plants. But at the same time, because it can balance renewables, it can help us make the most of them, and it can help us waste less of our renewable energy and in total generate more of it. The other thing I want to underscore here is it is not only renewable generation that goes up if we have new transmission, it is also renewable capacity. So if we had new transmission, it also makes investments in renewables economical and a greater part of the energy of the capacity mix, so to speak. To look at this in a little more detail, I'm showing what the energy mix in New England looks like for the first 2 weeks of October. And I've picked these 2 weeks because they're very illustrative. Our model, as John introduced, runs for all 8,760 hours of the year, but we can't show that here. So I'm only focusing on a small slice and specifically talking about a system that is decarbonized by 90%. So in black, the black line shows the amount of electricity demand for any given hour. And then the different colors show how we meet that electricity demand at an hourly resolution. So nuclear plants are providing something like a flexible base load, effectively in orange. Then in gray and brown, you see gas plants. In blue, you'll see wind. Solar is in yellow. And then in the teal color, again, you see imports from Quebec. On the negative side, you can see exports in purple from New England to Quebec. And in the sort of very light green color on the negative side, you also see when we charge batteries or we charge pump storage in New England, that also takes additional energy. But what I want to focus your attention on here is that there are periods out of the year when we have multiple days of low wind and solar output. So this might be, multiple days of low wind or low wind and solar at the same time. And these are not shortages that we can meet with lithium-ion batteries, because lithium-ion batteries are typically have a storage duration of between 4 and 8 hours, optimally speaking. And so in these periods, the model is dispatching gas plants to meet power demand, which are having to ramp up, leading to, as you might imagine, carbon emissions. You also see in the teal color that we get imports from Quebec during those hours, but those imports are constrained by the limited amount of transmission that we have. At the same time, though, we have other periods in the year when we have excess renewable generation that we don't know what to do with. We end up curtailing it in New England because it has nowhere to go and it cannot be stored anywhere with the technology set that we have included in our model. So what happens if we now install new transmission? If you look at those same periods of scarcity, when we have to run gas plants, now our need for gas is much less, and we're having to start up those plants much less or at a lower level, because instead we can import more energy from Quebec during those periods, which you see in the teal color there. And during other periods when we have extra renewable energy, we can export it. So we can make a greater use out of it. So overall, this underscores what I've shown before. New transmission allows us to integrate more renewables and use less gas. So I've shown you that this transmission to Quebec allows us to use the hydro in Quebec for this kind of multi-daily storage. In this slide, I want to show you that that's also the case for diurnal storage, so within a day, as well as seasonal storage. So in these two charts, I'm showing how the utilization of the hydro reservoirs in Quebec changes when we install new transmission. The top is showing the average day of the year. So we've taken all hours and averaged them so that we have, what an average 24-hour period would look like. And we see that new transmission allows us to run the hydro reservoirs more toward the end of the day, when, as you all know, we in New England have scarcity because solar output goes down, while at the same time hydro reservoir output adjusts in the middle of the day to accommodate this additional solar. So effectively providing this kind of daily storage. More important than the daily storage, though, is the seasonal storage, which is shown on the bottom chart, which is showing the same thing, so the change in hydro utilization from new transmission, but at a seasonal resolution. So what this says is that new transmission allows us to bring more hydropower during the summer when it's needed in New England, and at the same time use less hydro during the spring and during the fall when we have excess renewable generation here in New England. So the takeaway is hydro provides balancing at a daily and seasonal scale. So now that we kind of understand what the role of hydro is, the last research question that we had was, what would the economic value of that kind of balancing be? And this is my last slide. After that, we'll get to questions. So here I'm showing how the costs of the power system change as we install additional transmission. The horizontal axis shows different levels of decarbonization, and the vertical axis shows dollar amount of cost change. And the different colors are different categories of electricity system costs. So these might be fixed costs, or in other words, investment costs, or there might be variable costs, such as from burning gas fuel. So you see on the positive side that we have transmission costs that come with the 4 gigawatts of new transmission. But on the negative side, this new transmission allows us to decrease both variable and fixed costs that have to deal with burning gas or building carbon capture and storage plants that we otherwise now no longer need to do because we have this additional balancing from the hydro resource. The net amount of economic benefit that we get from this new transmission is shown with the red diamond. And our takeaway here is that it's become significant for very, very deep levels of decarbonization when we really need that balancing resource, especially at the seasonal resolution. To give you some sense of scale, the 100% scenario shown here has a saving of just over $2 billion, which ends up being around 24% saving. So 24% reduction on total electricity system costs. And this is across New England and Quebec. As John said, we're looking at the total pie and what the total savings for the both regions would be. So just to sum up, we find that in a low carbon future, the way that we should be thinking about hydro changes from the way that we're thinking about it now, at least according to this optimization framework that we've used. Number two is that if we built new transmission, we could further leverage the balancing capability of hydro in Quebec, providing a host of benefits, including the ability to integrate more renewable energy in New England. And number three, those kinds of effects have significant economic net benefits under very, very deep decarbonization. So that's my slides, and now I believe we'll take your questions.
Thank you, John and Emil. We received a few questions in advance. I'm going to dig into those first. And then I'm going to take the questions posted online. Again, for those of you who may not have heard, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type in a question. I do have quite a few already, and we'll get to as many as we can in the time we have. First question, at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers public hearing on the New England Clean Energy Connect in December, one piece of testimony cited research concluding that greenhouse gas emissions from Quebec hydropower were comparable to fossil fuel emissions. Is that true? Can you speak to that?
Well, we can speak to how that might intersect with our research results. So as I indicated at the very beginning, we're talking about a different way to utilize the existing hydro. So the utilizations we're describing does not produce any new emissions. So Quebec has already produced many, many reservoirs over the decades past. So there are a lot of emissions that have already been put into the atmosphere. Continuing to use long-established reservoirs does not produce new emissions at the rate that you're describing. But more importantly, switching their utilization to what we're describing doesn't change the emissions profile at all. So we're describing something where it will be better for the system as a whole, both for cost purposes and keeping within the emission limits, the different targets that we establish.
Thank you. The next question is, thanks for your presentation. Your model suggests overall costs of decarbonization would be decreased if, on average, Hydro-Québec buys about as much power from the Northeast as it sells. However, as a business, Hydro-Québec's goal is to maximize profits by obtaining power at a low cost and selling it at a higher price. what are your assumptions about the differences in the price that Hydro-Québec would pay for electricity imported from the Northeast and the price that it would charge for power it exports? If the price that Hydro-Québec paid for US power were much less than it charged, would the Northeast sending power to Quebec still make economic sense?
So yeah, this is a great question, a very important one. So I'll give you the bumper answer. The bumper sticker answer is yes, it would still make sense. That is, we show, looking at the entire system, both serving Quebec load, serving New England load, serving New York load, the total cost of the system to everybody is less if you do it the way we describe. And another way to say that is what I said at the initial set of slides. The maximum value to Quebec's asset of these reservoirs is if they switch utilization to being as a balancing resource. Now, we do not get into the details of how would that work, what kind of a market for trading at the border would there be? And that's a very important question to explore. But it is the case that both sides can benefit, which is what we show. And if you want to think about it, when we are telling Hydro-Québec, hey, you guys, you should think in the long run of using your reservoirs differently. And in fact, I know that's something that they're interested in hearing about, because you have to, when you make investments in your generation and in your control systems, if you're going to use it as a balancing resource, you will want the electronics in place that allow you to more quickly switch the utilization of the asset. So if you think about it, there are going to be hours of the year where New England needs the power badly. If Quebec has reserved its hydro to sell in those hours, it can make more money from the sale in those hours. And conversely, in order to have enough hydro to sell in the hours when New England needs it badly, Quebec needs to reserve its hydro, and it would be better for them to buy renewables from New England. So the bottom line is yes, but it is critical. It's a very good question. How will that come about? And there's a lot of details to be worked out in that.
Thank you. The next question is, why didn't you include New Brunswick, which has the dirtiest overall power sources, including 25% coal, in Northeast North America in your calculations?
Emil, do you want me to give you the tough question?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. We as researchers have to consider how much of the system to include in order to be able to provide a robust answer to the question of what is the systemic impact of transmission between these regions, and what is the systemic role of hydro, and that inevitably means we have to sacrifice some amount of detail. In the case of New Brunswick, for example, it might be that it could benefit from using more Quebec hydro in its energy mix, but that was, outside of our research scope, so to speak, unfortunately, but it's a valuable question to explore in the future. One thing that we do include in the modeling is we make sure that Quebec continues to sell as much energy as it has historically sold to its export partners, so to New Brunswick and to Ontario. So we are saying, how can the hydro optimally operate and contribute while continuing to provide for its historical role toward various export markets?
Thank you for that. The next question is Hydro-Québec willing to serve as a balancing resource instead of a base load? If they do, what are the implications for Quebec?
So we don't know if they're willing. We're trying to, this kind of research is trying to suggest they should consider it. So now the implications for Quebec, both sides of the border would have to make accommodations to make sure that this is a viable strategy. So you're increasing the interdependence between the two. There are power system considerations, stability of the grids you have to worry about. So it would take work to make it happen. But we hope people would consider it. That's the purpose of us throwing out this research.
The next question is, what is the New England Clean Energy Connect, the Clean Energy Corridor, doing to support solar and wind?
Should I take that, John?
Sure.
Sure. So without speaking to the project itself, I can kind of put it in the context of, what would the presence of that new transmission do for wind and solar in New England, which our research shows that it is beneficial for wind and solar by effectively allowing wind and solar owners in New England to sell their energy to Quebec during certain hours of the year. So the benefit to them would be, and again, this is in a low carbon future, not tomorrow, but the benefit would be that during hours when New England is using as much renewable energy as it can handle, these owners of these plants can export additional energy to Quebec. They have another market to provide them with additional revenue. And in our modeling, we find that when you expand the market this way, when you build this new transmission, it actually incentivizes new investments in new wind and solar capacity in New England. But again, that is talking about transmission in general and not the NECEC project specifically. As to what they're doing, I think you should. I'm not the one to speak for that.
Thank you. The next question is, given methane leakage from fracking and pipelines, should we accept continued use of natural gas?
No, that's the whole point, is to try to decarbonize, and we're looking at deep decarbonization. So we're looking at substitutes for natural gas.
Yeah, and to follow up, I think that's a great question. I think we show that this transmission between the two regions doesn't only have economic implications, but also environmental, because it helps us get out of gas sooner. As I've shown, what happens in our model when we build new transmission is we generate less energy from gas in New England. So that not only saves money, but and reduces CO2 emissions as well, but it also alleviates any other externality from upstream gas extraction that you're mentioning.
Next question. Are you accounting for minimum flows needed for fish and other aquatic life?
So yes, in the model, we have a minimum flow in every hour. So we are. I'm sure that there are many topics like the one Emil mentioned before with New Brunswick, where it would be great to explore it in more detail. But we did include a minimum flow for that reason.
And the next question is, do you assume that existing reservoirs have zero emissions? I believe literature suggests that existing reservoir emissions, both carbon dioxide and methane, are small, but not zero.
No, I mean, all technologies have a small amount of life cycle emissions, solar PV, wind, hydro as well. Hydro, it's very variable depending upon the reservoir. So we didn't assume that. As I said, in our results, we're not changing the reservoirs. So we're changing the utilization of the reservoirs. So we're not adding any emissions from the hydro. So when we talk about meeting emissions targets, we're talking about reducing emissions everywhere else, although we install more PV, solar PV, and more wind. So from a life cycle, there's probably some small increase there for them, while we're massively decreasing natural gas emissions.
Thank you. And I'll add that there is interesting research on life cycle emissions from hydropower from Quebec specifically as compared to other energy sources. Hydro-Québec is going to supply that with me, and I will share that information with all the attendees on the webinar. Was demand from Quebec included in the analysis?
Emil?
Yes. So we have a demand from Quebec and New England at an hourly resolution, and both regions have to meet their own demands and the way that's optimal to them. And as I mentioned before, we also included hourly demand from, or rather hourly exports to Ontario and New Brunswick. So we're taking into account all of the pressures that are being placed on the hydro system from every direction. So from demand in Quebec and New England and New York and Ontario and New Brunswick.
Thank you. We've got a lot of great questions here. The next one, what assumptions are made about the impact of subarctic climate changes on seasonal and yearly precipitation and water inflow to the reservoirs out to 2050?
Right, we did not take that into account. So it's a very good question. My general sense is this is not a region where those projected changes are going to decrease the hydro capacity, but nevertheless, we did not explore it. It'd be an interesting thing to explore.
Does this analysis include the expected demand increase due to the electrification of transportation and heating?
Emil?
In the results that I showed, very minimally so, we have, what I've shown is from our quote unquote base case scenario where we do not include a lot of electrification. However, we have an additional scenario in the paper where we electrify New England very aggressively based on scenarios from Department of Energy. And one of the concerns is, for example, well, if we electrify New England, then demand will be very high in the winter, and that's also when demand is very high in Quebec. What we find is that even if we have aggressive electrification, there are still large benefits from integrating the two regions with transmission and large benefits from interaction.
And the next question actually is a repeat of the last one, I think, for the most part. On slide 12, wondering where the offshore wind is.
That's the one.
Right, here. Offshore wind in our model is something that is mandated because of policy mandates. So there's offshore wind is forced into the system, and it is not considered economical enough to be expanded beyond that mandated amount. And it cannot be lowered because of the existence of the policy mandated we have in various New England states. Yeah, maybe I'll stop here.
Okay. Did you account for microgrids in the mix of transmission or just current large-scale transmission lines?
So the way we modeled transmission was in each of the separate regions like New York or New England or Quebec. We didn't explicitly model the transmission internal to any place. We assumed there was plenty of transmission to take care of all of the generation and load within each region. So we focused just on the interconnects between Quebec and New England and Quebec and New York. So we don't have microgrids, but we basically assumed that the internal grid was expanded as needed and working as needed internally to each region.
The next question is, what will be the economic cost to gas-based providers? How or would they be compensated for their reduced role?
Emil?
Yeah, we do not explore the sort of market policy reforms that might follow onto these kinds of changes that we're modeling. Obviously, gas plants will see fewer revenues. What we generally see is that new investments in gas plants are the ones that are especially vulnerable to the competition from Quebec Hydro for providing this balancing that we talk about. So I think the question is, operators of gas infrastructure need to consider what the medium to long-term future would look like and whether new investments make sense in that kind of environment. As to existing assets, a lot of our scenarios see them continuing to operate, but in some cases they are operated less and less and less with lower capacity factors, which is loss they take on the business that they're in just because of the competitive environment.
Was electrolysis considered for excess generation? The hydrogen can be used in gas plants with no carbon generation.
That's a good question, but we did not.
Good.
Sorry.
That's good.
We have time for just a couple more questions. Slide 16, are the value calculations annual or life cycle?
So those are annual. So we take the cost of the system, and it's an annualized cost, so what it takes to provide our energy for a year.
In slide number 13, you have 90% decarbonization in both cases, with and without new transmission, but with transmission has much less gas. How can a 90% decarbonization be the same in both?
Great question. So the 90% decarbonization here refers to the policy target that we have. What happens in the new transmission case is we are overachieving that target because we don't need the gas.
Great.
And in effect, it's more than 90% decarbonization, but the 90% refers to the policy target.
Got it. And the final question we have time for today, with the doubling of our energy requirements by 2050, will wind and solar have the capacity to meet this balancing scenario?
It's a good question. I think it's a matter of the ability to site wind and solar in New England, and that is a key constraint that we have not modeled, but that might limit our ability to expand wind and solar to the extent that we need to. There are a lot of potential sites that we can use in all New England states. We also have a lot of potential for offshore wind. The question is, will we realize this potential? And that is, to a large degree, a policy question and a question of solving bottlenecks around permitting, as well as challenges around siting of especially wind turbines in rural areas.
Well, we're 1 minute past our deadline here, so I want to thank you for spending the time with us and walking us through your compelling analysis, and thank you for spending time with us answering so many questions. We didn't get to all the questions, but I will follow up with all attendees and do our best to get responses to all of your excellent questions. Emil, John, Joshua, thank you very much, and thank you to all the attendees.
Thank you for having us.
I will also say we are recording this, and so once we are done with our editing, we will make the video available to the attendees as well. Thank you again.
Great, thank you.
Have a great evening.
Bye-bye, everyone.